Here, I want to end my talk in English, and I apologize in advance for my less than fluent mastery of the language. My last days amongst the hospitable American people have coincided with the 5th anniversary of tragic events of September 11th. These troubled times have seen their fair share of calamities, but the horrific terror unleashed on the Tuesday in September will no doubt come to be known as one of the greatest of the calamities. I was one of the first world leaders to condemn these barbaric and savage act. As a human, as a Muslim, and as an Iranian, I stand before you to once again express my deepest sympathy with the families of the victims and with all the great American people. Let us wish for a world devoid of violence and anger, and instead blessed with compassion and peace. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where we are fighting against a war on Iran and against one of the most embarrassing empires in world history. Really, this Trump moment it's a Rome and mega stupid moment. We're going to be talking about that on this week's program. Also, Drew Mikhael of Queen's University joins us in Belfast. We're talking about the escalating tensions because of U.S. actions on Iran, but then also how this affects the social movements that were emerging across the region. We're going to go in depth on that. And then Matt Christman, Cushbomb of Chapo Trap House is here. And we're going to talk about why it's got to be Bernie. He's going to give us a little primer maybe on sewer socialism. And why is it that Elizabeth Warren folds like a cheap suit under the aggressive and intellectually rigorous interrogation of Meghan McCain? Plus, Mike Bloomberg, he's learning how to go populist. All you dumb slobs like to watch Judge Judy during the day, right? Former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa has a word on elites in Latin America. We've got a gem on how banks target the poor. Bernie is swinging and swinging and swinging. And this might be the last Andrew Yang clip that we ever play. How could you? He supports humanity. It's not even going to be on the debate stage, but I don't take kindly to BSing about Medicare for all. Sorry to say. Lives are at stake. All that and much, much more on this week's TMBS. Brief programming note. Next week, we're going to be doing a show on Saturday. The time is not announced yet. Don't worry, we'll have a new show that will be premiered on Tuesday. And then we'll have a regular show. There won't be any show that will actually miss, but it will be Saturday instead of Tuesday. I'm going to be traveling next week. And as things go, I will let everybody know more about that traveling and some things that might come with that traveling. So might be very good stuff. Looking like it's going to be very good stuff. So I will let everybody know. But let's start in Australia, where brush fires are devastating that country. Animals are dying in the millions in just a heartbreaking, absolute massacre and destruction of species from every walk of life. According to the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, 2019 was both the hottest and driest year ever measured in Australia. The typical right-wing talking point, of course, is that brush fires are nothing new in Australia, and of course that's true, but the severity of this crisis is obviously amplified by the dryness and the weather patterns that are a result of global warming and global ecological pressure. This global ecological pressure was predicted for years to specifically affect Australia in this manner. Fires have now affected over 15 million acres and destroyed thousands of homes. Cities like Canberra and Sydney have been blanketed with smoke, making their air toxic. Across the country, air pollution has become a very significant problem as fires blaze. The response, led by Australia's right-wing Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, Scott Morrison, has been, as you'd expect, absolutely disastrous and morally repulsive. They have been reactive, and the federal government has not. They have not been reactive as in the way they need to be. The federal government has not worked with firefighters to coordinate comprehensive solutions. Lack of funding and attention to climate change has made the problem worse. But of course, that is precisely what you'd expect from the type of troglodytic governance that Morrison represents. Take a look at this clip from February 2017.
Mr. Speaker, this is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit opposite. From the Hunter Valley, as the member for Hunter would know. It's coal that has ensured for over 100 years
the Deputy Prime Minister
has enjoyed an energy competitive advantage that has delivered prosperity to Australian businesses and has ensured that Australian industry has been able to remain competitive on a global market.
Now, this exemplifies everything. And in fact, the Prime Minister was on trade missions and aggressively promoting coal overseas, even as this crisis started. But it really distills some very important points here. One, Australia is a microcosm of a global problem. Australia's center-left party also has had a very close relationship with the coal and other ecologically damaging industries. There is a Green Party that has real presence in Australia, and they're promoting a Green New Deal, which we'll get to in a moment. But as we see in so many examples, there is a intransigent, world-destroying, reactionary right wing that is following the logic of capitalism, which is that you just need growth, everything else damned, and then a punitive neoliberalism who, both because of the profound limits of its vision, will never actually come to terms with the ecological crisis, and because of its methodologies almost always target the middle class and the working poor, they generate an oppositional relationship between ecological outcomes and a already highly under pressure 99% in the context of global capitalism. We do need a Green New Deal. And we do need to recognize the incredible importance of the leadership of Bernie Sanders and AOC and leaders across the world in talking about this. But we also need to be very aware that if we don't do this with a global vision that is coordinated with an international effort from the relationships between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, the European Union, a real serious partnership built on technology transfer, mutual trade, debt relief, and other steps across the developed world that have been undermined by corporate exploitation and imperial foreign policy, the Green New Deal itself can replicate some of the same problems and dynamics that have gotten us to where we are today. Really important piece of work that I want to mention, put up on screen, in the Global African Worker that our friend Bill Fletcher Jr. is involved in. This piece is called The Coming Green Imperialism. And I want to just quote, The Coming Green Colonialism, rather. And I want to quote from this piece, which I'll tweet out later. So-called nature-based solutions, including carbon offsetting mechanisms that allow polluters to carry on polluting while claiming that their pollution or emissions are offset by mitigating activities such as planting trees or corralling off forests as carbon sinks. When nations speak of carbon neutrality, they're basically speaking of solving the climate crisis through mathematics and not through any real climate action. And this is in relation to a very disappointing recent UN climate conference, which once again focused on scientific statements and techno-micro solutions, which can, as an example, if we don't get serious, lead to, look, there is no doubt that the proliferation of electronic cars had a relationship to the coup in Bolivia. Vital natural resources are still going to play a role in the energy transition. So the question is, how do you manage the extraction of those resources in a way that does not replicate the same patterns? It's no longer enough to talk about raising awareness. It's about talking about the root causes of climate change, and that is capitalism. In terms of reality, we need to graduate. Capitalism is on a collision course with planet Earth, and time is running out. And that's global warming, that's species elimination, and that is also the quality of life and well-being for a vast majority of humans on this planet. The right wing will add fuel to the fire. They will throw gasoline on a koala bear themselves. But the center will do nothing that upsets global finance. For most people, inaction is not an option anymore, but climate action in the global north cannot be at the expense of the global south. We must be clear about the causes of climate destruction and support a Green New Deal that addresses the problem without sacrificing the global south to a new green colonialism. You guys have anything you want to add?
I'd just add that one thing that's been so frightening about this global right-wing resurgence has been the environmental devastation. I mean, obviously, Bolsonaro is a great example of that. And it's a real moment where people on the left in the U.S. and across the world need to really start taking the challenge seriously. And two, it should be a wake-up moment for a lot of people in the environmental movement, the ones who are on the more like apolitical side, that you're not just going to be able to convince technocrats to be able to flip a switch and change these economies. We have to win politically. I mean, this is a fundamental human battle, but it's a fundamental political battle at the end of the day. And also, I think that last point is so important. It's something that was, an early criticism of early ideas of the Green New Deal, that, the United States was going to export patents to green technology to the rest of the world. It's like, no, the United States cannot use this as an opportunity to profit off of the backs of Africa, Asia, South America, and Central America. They absolutely need to take the responsibility for what we've done as a country and help people move and transition into a new kind of relationship with our planet and a new kind of economic system.
Without a doubt. All right, folks, can we do the Alex Jones shout out for old time's sake? What do you guys think? I've been hearing a lot of complaints that we haven't had that for a while. So
let's get to the shout out. Creepy. Shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out. This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird. Shout out.
I want to give a little bit of a shout out to Portugal's center-left government, still in power. And this is significant. This piece is from a year ago but it actually does a pretty good job of sort of setting up some of the basic parameters of what the Antonio Costa government has been able to achieve. This is significant because I think for those of us who do recognize that there does need to be a left push beyond social democracy, it's still important. I mean, the recent election in Spain, forming a socialist and Podemos coalition, is significant. We don't want to root at all for a complete collapse of these forces and parties in Europe, particularly when the alternatives have been so damaging. And Portugal has been able to stay in power and fend off the right wing through a solid anti-austerity agenda. That seems to be, and it shouldn't surprise anybody, a very baseline for maintaining any kind of center-left momentum, completely rejecting the zombie idea and the public terrorism of austerity. I'm going to quote a little bit from the piece now. A turning point in 2015, famous Lisbon mayor Costa is elected prime minister. The first major change occurred during the general election 2015. This was a time when the right-wing conservative government had dismantled social welfare state piece by piece, which resulted in a furious population voicing their dissatisfaction in the voting booth and causing conservatives to lose 11% of their previous electoral votes. Lisbon's former mayor Antonio Costa, a socialist, won by a landslide and brought in 32% after being, and at first, he was fought harshly by the Europeans and by Angela Merkel. Germany's finance minister saw it as a, quote, grave mistake that Portugal would depart from austerity. And then, of course, that led to what was written of and called in this article a miraculous economic recovery, because, of course, the austerity strategy is a disaster. They reversed austerity. They did that through raising taxes on the wealthy and beginning to try to piece together again their social welfare state. And I think this is really important because I don't see a piece of all of these various pieces we're moving that does not involve some resiliency of social democratic forces. So in other words, obviously there's nothing more important right now in the United States than the Sanders candidacy. Is the Sanders candidacy the be-all and end-all of what can and needs to be achieved politically? Of course not. I mean, and obviously in a mature adult worldview, nothing ever is. But the reason we want, and this is the paradox, right? The reason we want to get beyond what Sanders is proposing is so we can safeguard what Sanders is proposing. That's the lesson of the last, post-Cold War, World War II and consensus being destroyed, right? Which is that social democratic New Deal gains are always uprooted by the capitalist class. So we need something to actually break their power. Ultimately, that's serious labor power. But conversely, in environments of such utter devastation and deprivation, really vital, humane social democratic reforms like the ones Sanders is running on and the ones that have been achieved by the Costa government in Portugal are what can start to open up the space for people to have the capacity to act politically. So this is important. Shout out to Portugal. Let's get to the pitch. I want to do a little plug on the website, TMBS.fm. Check out the merch. We've been starting to sell a lot of gear, and we will start mailing stuff out later in the month. Go to the menu and check out the merch catalog. Not merch. Catalog. And so check out the TMBS Worldwide hoodie as an example. I love the look of that. We've got tees. We've also got the long sleeve hoodie in white. These are 2 out of 3 of these are union made. One is basically the hoodie couldn't be union produced. So we went to a place that is all full benefits and living wage. This is, I happen to really like how these look. We tried to actually spend some real time designing them a little bit and working with Adam on them. So obviously it helps promote the show, and then, it's another source for us, both in terms of show promotion, but also revenue to do the things we do, like investing in projects like the Illicit History documentaries, which of course the patrons help first and foremost. That's the most important thing. But if you're interested, snag up your gear. Another thing you can do on the website, if we can go back to the menu, is get information on upcoming shows. And you will see here, that's it. On live shows, you got it. Click here. You will see that February 7th, we have a live show at the Bell House. Oh no, we're good. Really excited about this. Alona Minkowski is coming. I could not be more excited about that. Brandon Sutton is coming, at Pretty Bad Lefty on Twitter. He's hilarious. Our mentor, New Deal scholar Harvey K is going to be there. The logician in chief, Ben Burgess, is going to be there. And then, for a little nostalgia, for a super deep cut, Matt Binder is going to be there. This is the point where, things are obviously never selling as much, in the month out. But I could tell you that we were at that sales point where, basically, like, if we go by the Philadelphia thing, we'll probably sell this out. So I'd snag your tickets quickly. You can get your VIP tickets, hang out with us at 6. It's going to be a really fun show. I think Mike Racine and I might also cook up a pre-recorded sketch for it. We have a ton of fun at these, and we're going to have more to announce in the future. But for now, grab your tickets February 7th at the Bell House. I think there might be a debate that night, so might possibly do some type of live debate reaction. Possibly, not too much, because we want these things to be long-lasting. And then become a patron. That's the most important thing. It sustains and allows us to do absolutely everything. And it really is the way to fully experience the show. As an example, this last weekend, we had Derek Davidson on the main show. It was really great, really important. For Sunday, the illicit history of the modern relationship between the United States and Iran, and also the nature of the governance of the Islamic Republic. There are so many stories there now that cover the Middle East in depth, as an example. Turkey, Iran, the Kurds, Israel, Palestine, with journalists, experts, activists. And then we have the post games are a lot of fun. That's all I could say. Watching us riff Trump West Wing or whatever, just having like a different vibe. So we invite you to join. We're excited about our growth, and it's all due to you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Become a patron today. It's time. And if you haven't yet, the last thing I will ask is we're like 700 away from our first 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So if you haven't yet, click subscribe, click the bell so you get the notification. And, look, everything helps. If you want to, obviously feel free to drop a super chat during the show. Huge amount of work goes into all of this because we really believe in this stuff, and we really immensely appreciate the community, the support, and the expansion. So, honored to do it. Thanks so much. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Drew Mikhael. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Pleasure to welcome to the main show. We've done some histories. We did a 2-part history on Hezbollah with him. We did an on-the-ground report from Lebanon for the Illicit History series on the Sunday shows. Here he is on the main show, Drew Mikhael. He's a fellow at Queen's University in Belfast, and he is a specialist in the Middle East who has done extensive on-the-ground work in Beirut in Lebanon. Drew, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Drew, we were going to talk about how this warmongering, I'm not going to, be diplomatic about it, and this extraordinary, dangerous and illegal escalation by this extraordinary moron in the White House is undermining, and I apologize for the non-classed up BBC introduction, but this is where I'm at. And how it's affecting the social movements that have been emerging in the region, particularly in Lebanon. But before we get there, I mean, as of Showtime, just right before we went on, there was a report that the United States, that Iran has launched missiles at U.S. air bases in Iraq. What's your interpretation of this Iranian move?
So, I'd just like to say that I thought it would be coming on and having a nice deep dive into the possible ramifications long term, putting an academic in the live news reporting spot. But I think that this is an era of performativity in politics. I think that you mentioned warmongering, moron. I certainly would concur with everything you just said. I think that the actions of Trump, and if the reports are to be believed coming out of the Pentagon, all the White House reporting, is that this was, potentially a slide that his advisors didn't expect him to take. This was an option that they presented on the table as something that would be very dramatic and probably ill-advised. At that point, knowing how important Soleimani was, and you mentioned him in your main show the other day, and one point that I think was missing was the fact that he was a character who is described by the current Ayatollah as a living embodiment of the regime, of the Islamic resistance in Iran. So there always had to be a response. Now, a lot of experts many of which have been batted around different ideas about what might happen, whether Hezbollah would attack Israel, would one of the other proxies, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, attack the embassy. I don't think that we quite expected a direct attack emanating from Iran itself. This is a very poignant message. And I started by saying performativity. And what I hope, and certainly what U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq have been prepared for, has been a direct attack. And they have earlier on the day been in bunkers, and they have definitely steeled themselves for this kind of offensive. What I hope is that this is just Iran performing an apparent escalation to then eventually retreat to a calmer state of affairs.
Let's talk. We're going to get into how this is affecting the broader kind of anti-austerity, anti-sectarian movements, the sectarian movements that have been really, inspiring and emanating from the Middle East, particularly Lebanon. But you talked about this idea of him embodying the revolution and this idea of Shia politics as resistance. And I do think, I did a stream last night. I think it's very important that whatever else one thinks, that people are incredibly clear that Shiite Islamic politics, to put just maybe, simplify it a bit, Shiite Islamic politics and Salafist, I'll say Salafist instead of Sunni, are very different propositions.
Right.
So when you're talking about Hezbollah, when you're talking about Iran, yes, there's religion, there's social conservatism, there's concepts of martyrdom, but there's also a actual anti-colonial politics, an actual anti-imperial politics, and real terrestrial concerns. And I want to also just put out as well that, Foreign Policy magazine or Foreign Affairs just actually put out a piece basically talking about how, Al-Qaeda's new moderate phase, which I think just really exemplifies the schizophrenia of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that is so fixated on one regime and one group, precisely because they actually do have some anti-hegemonic leanings, but they are much more rational actors. And then a willingness to look the other way and deal with groups that actually have much more narrow and fully fanatical agendas and do commit like just overt and objective acts of terrorism. Right. So could you talk about that relationship and what we're actually talking about here in terms of this resistance politics?
Right. I think that, we're very keen in a Middle East that is made up of a multitude of different ethnicities, religions, and languages that live in a wide social mosaic. It's very, very hard, especially if you're the US, to then try and parse through the different pathologies that have led to the creation of a variety of different states and different borders, and what different groups have existed across those. Not to mention the fact that we've seen a Middle East that has gone through successive it went through a phase of, first of all, having imposed monarchies. Then it went through a phase of resistance against those monarchies by pan-Arab nationalists of varying degrees who had different regional and national agendas. And then what you mentioned, I think that we try to, and what I love about your show and why I'm really happy to be here talking, is that we try to reject those essentializations of what it means to have a Shia resistance or what it means to be Salafist and Sunni. We have to contextualize that the Shia, or what we've characterized now as Shia resistance, was in opposition certainly to the Shah in Iran. And what came about in 1979, which is most often characterized in shorthand now as the Islamic Iranian Revolution, didn't also start out as such. It started out as a revolution by a variety of different actors, of which Islamicists were one part of it as well, and eventually managed to gain control of the key mechanisms of the state through military force as well. Now, what happened in Iran being able to spread its, shall we say, for lack of a better term or shorthand, is like resistance brand that is focused on Shiism throughout the Middle East. Particularly in 1979, you had a war in Lebanon that completely destroyed any functionality of the state. And they were managed to establish Shia proxies who were also anti-hegemon at that point within the Lebanese context, which was against particular leaders who had dominated the state. So because the Shia in Lebanon up until that point were basically an underclass. So they jumped on the fact that a large part of the Shia were an underclass and started to create and add Islamicist tendencies to an overall current of disenfranchisement in that country. So it very much is a case of, and this is whenever we talk about Islam, there is no such thing as one political Islam. There are not even in its broad houses, there are political Islams or Islams generally, because it is fiercely reactive to exactly what is happening around the context in which particular imams are able to speak to it, to try to speak to political issues, and regionally and internationally as well.
So then, with that perfect setup, explain, how the movements that have been emerging, I guess, particularly in Lebanon, and how they have been, I read an interview with a former Egyptian foreign minister who said, what he found most encouraging about these protests was that it seemed to be a real rejection of sectarian division and a unity around some form of basically kind of class politics or certain type of anti-corruption politics. Mm-hmm. First of all, is that true? And then secondly, is this another long line of outside interference from the West undermines actual political current for real change?
I think that I would unfortunately characterize it as the latter. My cynical and negative head would say that is the latter. Yes, the first question, I would agree that it's certainly in Lebanon, certainly in Iraq, and certainly what we've seen in Iran, not for the first time. Obviously, we've just passed into the new decade, but in 2009 we had significant protests, anti-corruption protests, popular protests in Iran as well. I would characterize it, certainly from my experience on the ground in Lebanon, that this is the first truly cross-class, cross-sectarian popular mobilization in the country's history that has reached into different levels of the country, has permeated different strongholds of different political actors. And to highlight this point and to stay on topic with resistance politics was that Hezbollah has always traded on a very particular current of being the resistance. It was the only group in Lebanon that was not forced by the peace agreement to give up its arms because it was, quote, the resistance against Israel who had still occupied the country. Now, it is traded on this concept of resistance while it is engaged in exactly the same clientelistic patronage networks that all the other corrupt Lebanese political parties have engaged with. So it has managed to insulate itself somewhat from observing some of the criticism that all the other Lebanese parties have because it was the party of resistance. And what was interesting about the Lebanese protests is that even in Hezbollah strongholds, ordinary Shia were taking to the streets and criticizing Hezbollah as a part of that current ruling cabal in Lebanon. And that is the first time since its creation and since its formation as Hezbollah, as a militant party and a political party, that this has happened. So that in and of itself shows you the depth of this movement, how it has reached across class and has undermined political structures that Hezbollah has traded on, that have been so far, up until now, very strong. Now, I will go on and say that my fear is that this might be, unfortunately, a long line of mistimed, misguided foreign interventions that have undermined real grassroots currents is that what we don't want to see is a re-sectarianization of Lebanon or of Iraq or any other state that has a popular movement, because the reason why ethnicity and sectarianism is such an important current in these political structures is because they aren't democratic, that they are using political elites who trade on ethnic, national and religious identities, that they make sure that that groups have security dilemmas, that they live in fear of one another. So what might happen, and what I fear might happen here, is that there is a quote unquote a rise of resistance against the West, for example, that constellates around a Shia identity. And we have already seen in Iraq that there had been pro-Iranian politicians and militant groups that had characterized this anti-austerity protest as potentially a Sunni protest, which is automatically starting to sectarianize the ground even more so, which may eventually lead to, as we have seen in the last couple of days, some pro-Iranian Shia militant parties actually shooting at protesters.
Do you think on the flip side, is it possible, because I think it's, some people might overstate it, but I do think a figure like General Soleimani, certainly, Pepe Escobar, who's been on this show writing in Asia Times, would say that, General Soleimani, of course, first and foremost for Iran, and then sort of for a certain type of Shiism, but actually in a much broader way, figure like this could also just be interpreted as representative of like the resistance writ large to like the imperial order, basically, right? So somebody on the receiving end of U.S. interference in Latin America or Africa could look at a figure like this and have very different politics or positions and so on, but say, well, okay, there was somebody who put up a fight, Mm-hmm. And what I'm wondering about that then is you don't see a possibility of some sense of that, we're going to organize to fight Trump, across class and sectarian lines, because whatever else we think, I mean, maybe we're not particularly fond of Netanyahu or MBS. I mean, is that a possibility?
I don't see it as a possibility. I mean, your characterization of Soleimani is correct. I mean, certainly that was a reputation that he fostered. But I mean, I don't want to over-egg the pudding, but like in speaking with, since last Friday, it feels a lot longer, but in speaking with various different people on the ground across the Middle East, Soleimani had a Saddam-esque aura to him. He was, while we see, X amount, the report of 1 million people turning out for his protest in Iran, he has just as many detractors across those countries that do remember the role he played in the siege of Aleppo, and do remember the role he played in the killing of Rafiq Hariri, and do sort of see that this was a man who kind of paid for his sins as well. There is feeling across these different countries amongst a lot of different people that this was a guy who got what was coming to him in a lot of ways. So,
but that would go along. I mean, like certainly not in Iran, and that would go along sectarian lines.
No, I mean, especially considering that Kurdish. The Kurds in Iran certainly don't see him as a figure worth, as a martyr, as someone. They see him again as a particular figure who was a member of an oppressive regime that helped keep them as an underclass. So I think that there was just like his essentially maybe not seeing him as a Che Guevara like character, but it would almost be like, I think, equating him to like reverence of a ex-director of the CIA, and considering the different proxy wars and the different protest movements that he has helped, popular protest movements that he's helped keep suppressed. Essentially, there's no way that I see him being a potential uniting figure for across class or sect.
Well, even beyond, okay, so then let me take him out of the equation. What about just Donald Trump murdering people and starting war and kind of, crude imperialism back in the region?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I think that definitely would have a lot more currency, especially whenever you have a character like Donald Trump, right, who's just so obtuse and such a bloated, is a caricature, really. He's not a real person. And that would definitely have a lot more sort of currency. But even thinking back to the days of when we could equate to some kind of semblance of pan-Arab unity in the Middle East with Gamal Abdel Nasser, it was a case of former president of Egypt. His victory after the Suez Canal against colonial forces might be closest to the type of movement that you're talking about. But the problem that occurred after Nasser was that he overreached in trying to create a particularly a pan-Arabist identity. Now, it may have had different pan-Arab parties in Syria and Egypt and across the region that he tried to unite with, but he was still trying to establish his own pan-Arab identity. And whenever he created a brief unity with Syria, it was very much an Egyptian hegemony that was the problem. So even in those moments, whenever we had vaguely left-wing politics under a sort of ethnic nationalism that was pan the region, it still faltered under smaller sub-regional, i.e. national identities.
As a final in this one, well, I'll try to keep it more on your. Well, I want you to put on your strategy hat.
Okay.
If you were in a position, and I think actually in some, even just this kind of conversation, you are in some ways. What would be, and I just want to keep clarifying. I mean, I think to some extent, just like in the United States right now, a lot look like when the forces of war in the United States are in assemblage like this, you can't you do just need to have the extremely clear and efficient anti-war position, because there isn't a great deal of time for any sort of nuance when you're in, a human-created emergency. So I think obviously a lot of energy, in the region is going to be around even just setting aside, various political factions that, God forbid, in the worst case scenario, the United States actually, undertaking that could kill an extraordinary amount of innocent people in Iran, right? So that being said, I mean, but in a way that would be balanced with that, what would be a strategic approach to recognizing that right now we are, that centralizing the resistance to any type of further interference and killing with Iran, but also not allowing the reassertion of an old style sectarian politics to sort of suffocate what had been potentially emerging?
It's a really, really good question. And in speaking to people on the ground in Lebanon who have made so many gains in defeating cult of personality around their particular corrupt clientelistic leaders, saw the reemergence of a mass amount of posters and trying to re-sectarianize the current movement. And what we're seeing is a counter protest against that in Lebanon in the last couple of days. And I think that it's important that we don't lose sight of those people who are fighting those daily lives, and really trying to tackle the real world consequences of the state in which they live, which are in Iran suppression, the internet being taken down, so up to 1,500 protesters to be murdered. That we focus on human rights abuses, that we focus on freedom of expression, that we focus on the people who are leading these protests on the ground to try and democratize their environments. And if we focus on supporting them, in which encouraging their own government not to launch weapons that might lead to them being collateral damage, first of all, and also to support them politically and to show solidarity, that would be where I would focus 90% of my strategy.
So my question, and this is a genuine, it's something I struggle with and think about a lot, is what is the balance between, I mean, to me, I make a pretty clear distinction. I think clearly in Latin America, there's a lot of governments that have been very controversial, and I think it's either, essentially almost entirely dishonest. Like, Evo Morales was a democratically elected and highly effective leader, and he certainly was, not perfect, as no leader is, but most of the left critiques, quote unquote, were coming either from people who would vehemently oppose the coup against him, or from AstroTurf groups that don't really represent the left, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in the Middle East, it's frankly more complicated in some ways, because of course, Assyria is sort of like a ground zero of all of this, where recognizing the role of the CIA, the role of the Gulf states and Salafist groups, but then also recognizing the role of Iran and Russia and Assad. I mean, this is something we all have to take on at once. And, one tendency can become basically if you are on the other side of the United States, then we'll have just a sort of uncritical, stance, and we can whitewash the problems in various places. I reject that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there's no doubt that in the day-to-day of popular, I'm not trying to ramble here, but very specifically, it's really important that people in the United States see Nasrallah and the supreme leader saying we don't have an interest in harming U.S. civilians. And I make all sorts of, and I can make all sorts of jokes, some of which are tongue in cheek, some of which are honest. I mean, look, I do have a hell of a lot more, infinitely more respect for Rouhani than I do for Trump. Of course, I'm not going to hide the ball on that. Mm-hmm. But the point of showing those clips is not to say that these are perfect leaders or perfect groups, and I don't have, solidarity with people, to the extent there's people on the left, struggling against them, or Baha'is or whatever. Of course not. But the people in the West need to know that. And it is of paramount importance that any propaganda in our context that forward the push to war and assassination be pushed back on. And of course, we know, particularly going back to the Iraq invasion days, that so many even sincere voices who did document the appalling crimes of Saddam Hussein were simply purely operationalized to be an instrument of a vicious, illegal invasion and war. And the same in Afghanistan, for that matter. So I don't know how to thread that needle. I'd be curious your thoughts, because it's something I think about a lot.
Can I sort of say something bold and sort of say, as a person on the left, that generally this is our problem with a number of different issues, that we have to add nuance to the argument, that what we're talking about is a non-essentialization of groups, peoples across a variety of different countries that have different political histories and different social histories, and different groups within those countries that have different leanings and understandings. That it's important that we don't essentialize any of these conflicts, that we keep waving the flag for a deeper understanding about what is going on, that we can have. That we reject the binary understandings of what it means to live and work in Lebanon or Iraq or Iran, and what it means to live and work and struggle under these different regimes if you're different people. What I can say is, then you mentioned about Rouhani, and I think that in the end that we have to be a politics of compromise, is that that we're in this, let's be honest, we're currently talking about this issue because Donald Trump decided to act irrationally.
Right.
We both have serious misgivings about Obama's policies now domestically, and I have serious misgivings about his policies in the Middle East. But what I don't have misgivings for was his commitment to actually working towards a compromise with Iran and a thawing of relations with Iran, because I believe that, yes, the Islamic State of Iran and its government is not something that I would ever proffer or a vision I want for the region. It's definitely not as a secular left guy, completely polar opposite.
Right.
But politics is also not only about like large institutions. Again, that would just be to essentialize the Islamic Republic of Iran are all crazy religious clerics who just want to subjugate everybody.
Ridiculous, right?
Right, exactly. What we had, like, compare Rouhani to Ahmadinejad, okay? Completely polar opposite characters. There's no way that Obama could have been able to compromise with Ahmadinejad because of his, let's be honest, his own Trumpian nature and politics. We have to understand that within institutions that there are still moments of negotiation that can happen, that can lead medium and long term towards incremental change. And in a regime like Iran that has deep military capabilities, specifically guided at suppressing its own people, that is about the best that we can hope for at this point. And what happened, torpedoing the nuclear deal, set us on this path to what we're dealing with today. So I would say that we seek the compromises when we can. We definitely reject the essentializations, and we reject binary outcomes and escalations like war, which will be catastrophic for all the people that we're trying to fight for.
Drew Mikhael, really appreciate your time as always, brother. Fellow at Queen's University. Thanks so much, man.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for staying up. All right, folks. We are going to get to the gem. It's gem time. Are you ready? Can you follow up that accent?
No, I don't have a good Irish accent at all. We talk a lot during this segment about the destruction that the banks have, done to our society at large, with the financial crisis and just their greed and cruelty and cavalier attitude, basically, to the lives of most working people. But I also wanted to talk about another massive crisis that's going on at the same time. For a lot of rural Americans, there has been a massive loss of access to banks at all. So just between 2012 and 2017, more than 1,500 bank branches have closed in rural America. And that means that, people in these poor, deprived areas don't have access to, the simple kind of check cashing, even, going to an ATM, the kind of services that we've, grown accustomed to. And especially in areas where there's a lot of economic devastation, not having access to, being able to access loans or anything like that is a very big problem. And for the people in those communities, the banks that stick around are really, really predatory. So you're seeing people having, minimum account balance fees. So like if your account goes beneath a certain balance, then you get a fine from the bank. And in a lot of these areas, especially like rural South Carolina, what they call a reasonable account balance level is like $200. These are places where the median average yearly wage is hovering between in the low 20,000 a year. I mean, these are not people who have tremendous amounts of cash to be sitting on. And people live lives, through overdrafts and these banking fees, and it creates a cycle of poverty where you are constantly working back your previous paycheck. It's a massive problem. And it's a problem for rural Americans. It's also a problem for working class Americans and for people of color. This is something that is absolutely ridiculous when you find out that a study that was done in 2018 found that people of color in the United States actually have higher on average minimum account balance levels that they are supposed to uphold as part of their banking, means that these banks are just subtracting money out of working class people of color's bank accounts that other parts of the country are not subjected to. So these are already people who make less on average than other people. These are people who don't have the same kind of economic opportunities as others, and they're being attacked basically by these banks. Now, we know how the terrible cycle of overdraft fees, in 2017, Americans paid $34.3 billion in overdraft fees. And again, these account fees really target poor and people of color communities across the country. So look, what's the solution? People definitely, they need access to banks, they need loans for the community, and, they need access to credit. Now, we also need to remember the context, too, in the United States, the important role that banks played in racial segregation in this country through, creating very predatory loans to Black people who wanted to buy housing and things of that nature too, is that there's a whole role that the banking system has played in disenfranchising and impoverishing, large segments of the population. So, you can try regulation, but in the context of our financialized economy, that very much happened in the 80s, and that's when a lot of these fees started to come about too. It's when we moved from a kind of productive economy into an overly financialized economy. So you could try regulation, but, think about the CFPB, they put regulations on payday lenders, who are another group that, takes advantage of people who are unbanked, who need cash checking, check cashing services, payday loans, etc. They put on regulations, and what happens when a right winger comes into power? Trump takes those away, right? So, you could try regulations, but what we really need to do is to create a new way of giving people access to banking. And that is simple. We can create public banks. Postal banking is a phenomenal idea, not only because it can immediately has the infrastructure to go into communities that are already underserved by national banks. We can decide the kind of rates that we're going to give to people in impoverished communities. We can get rid of racialized practices. We can get rid of practices that are basically only set up for the bank's profit, like overdraft fees and minimum account balance fees. We can also use these as ways to spur economic growth in areas that have been underserved. So we can say to our, public banks or postal banks that, we're going to give interest rate loans at very low interest rates to people in this community, right? Because this community does not have access to credit, and we need to spur, economic growth and innovation in that community. That's a way that we can actually, in a fairly quick and simple way, actually revitalize a lot of communities that have been completely left behind by the United States financial system. because the current system is not working at all. It's not working because of the macro crisis that is constantly happening from organizations like Goldman Sachs, and it's also not working for poor and working class Americans across the country who don't even have access to basic banking services because of a system that is, has been created to prey on them from the very beginning.
Check out Marissa Baradaran, great guest on postal banking. So we got I don't know where Matt Christman is. I think he's still, I think he's en route. But regardless, I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, and it's very difficult, when breaking news happens in some ways, because we're scrambling, and also the design of this show is definitely to be more long lasting. So I want to provide context for what this situation is so we can actually understand. But let's play some clips. I mean, look, Iran is hitting bases in Iraq. That's the reporting. They're shooting surface-to-air missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq. These bases also store have a lot of Iraqi soldiers. So the other big kind of potential fallout from this, in addition to the escalation in the United States, could be precisely, now I don't know the makeup here. I mean, presumably, the Iraqi army, it could be Shia, it could be Sunni. I don't know the implications in terms of internal sectarian politics in Iraq as a result of these strikes. What do we have here?
This is just a clip. It's sort of the liberal MSNBC guest.
And here we are. And now, of course, you will see a massive outpouring of warmongering from people who every day the rest of the week, Donald Trump is so uncouth, Donald Trump is so dangerous, Donald Trump is so this and so that. I mean, that is all MSNBC and CNN content seem to be. Here is Ari Melber, or I believe, having General Barry McCaffrey. Now, General Barry McCaffrey, the last I checked, and you should look up, there was a piece in the Intercept I would like one of you guys to find that just came out today, basically saying all of these cable networks should disclose all of the defense industry positions that all of these ghouls that come on these fucking shows promoting war sit on. But let's watch this clip with Jerry. This is Barry McCaffrey just now on MSNBC, warmongering.
General McCaffrey, with the moment we have left, what should people keep in mind?
Well, I think we'll wait till the facts come in. It sounds as if the Iranians have made a strategic decision to directly employ military power against U.S. forces in the region. I don't think, as Ben mentioned, we've seen the end of this. They're announcing this is a phase of a more comprehensive attack. And I would think that the days ahead are going to be perilous, because our only good response at this point is an overwhelming dominance of U.S. air and naval power that can be employed against the Iranian homeland. And that means against the IRGC, their submarine force, their fast boats, their rocket units. When that goes, we're really into high-intensity warfare with the Iranians.
So this is absolutely catastrophic. We already have lived most of if you are in your 30s, your adult life, not to mention if you're younger, we'll talk about fighter pilots in Afghanistan who were born after the September 11th terrorist attacks. Afghanistan, longest U.S. war in history, still killing endless Afghan civilians, have blown off U.S. soldiers' legs, U.S. soldiers have died, endless war crimes, endless political stagnation. And at the end of the day, a stalemate, because people don't like their countries occupied by foreign forces. It benefits the arms and defense contractors. It benefits the Pakistani intelligence agencies. It benefits, the warlords in Afghanistan. It benefits the heroin trade. It benefits CIA budgets. It benefits predator drone programs. Then, of course, we have Iraq. This is all still spilling out of Iraq. And by the way, the latest reporting and claims from Iraqi officials, which I have no reason not to believe, is that General Soleimani, and think about it, this guy flew into Baghdad on a commercial flight. This is somebody whose whole life is in intelligence operations, is in building guerrilla armies, in subterranean tactics. He flew on a commercial flight into Baghdad, not trying to hide his presence, promptly met with the Iraqi head of a Shiite militia, who was the other person assassinated in this drone strike. And the point was that apparently they were there to meet to begin some type of indirect dialogue or convey a message to Saudi, because apparently the Gulf states had concluded that this war that they had been pushing for wasn't going to happen, and they needed to actually rethink their strategy with regards to Iran. You have that assassination. He's not going to be here till about 8:30. You have, thanks though. You have that assassination. The Iranians, and look, this is what I'm talking about here. This is why, we have to have the bigger and broader conversations. But for purposes of what's happening right now, we are the pure aggressors. We are the pure aggressors. Let's just condense the timeline, right? We can go back to the 1980s where the United States backed Saddam Hussein while he was using chemical weapons against Iran. We can go back to the airliner that was blown up. We can go back to the 2001 rapprochement that was offered by Iran and then destroyed in no small part specifically by the words of that fucking moron, David Frum, that everybody is so excited about having on their show because he thinks that Donald Trump isn't classy. He wrote the Axis of Evil speech and helped put Iran in the crosshairs of a dangerous, belligerent, lunatic Bush administration, even as Iran had been coordinating against the Taliban because they were, of course, opponents of the Taliban. So then you go fast forward. By the way, you have 2 Iran deals. The first Iran deal is negotiated by President Lula and with the support of Turkey. It's a very similar deal. It's rejected by Obama and the Europeans very basically because the U.S. didn't do it. It was a statement about we don't want a developing world leader to get the credit for that kind of diplomatic breakthrough. But you had Iranian stakeholders already agree to that. Period. Then you have the Iran deal, painstakingly negotiated, and it is by design not supposed to be a comprehensive universal deal. It is supposed to deal with the nuclear program, which, by the way, has never been proven and has been vehemently denied with no serious countervailing evidence that they wanted to weaponize. And by the way, is there any lesson for anybody in the world to learn from all of this other than, oh, fuck, I better proliferate a weapon as quickly as possible? There is no other rational conclusion from what these fucking lunatics, from the bloated asshole in the White House to these defense industry stuffed faces on cable news, there is no other conclusion that a country could learn. Trump comes in from the beginning, goes back into ratcheting up sanctions, is constantly complaining about the deal. Then he tears up the deal, even though nobody had said, the United States, the Atomic Energy Agency, everybody said Iran is following the deal. Then there's unremittent economic warfare. Then we assassinate their top general. What could they possibly have done? You know, a lot of people were banking on the idea that Iran would do something more tactical and more minimal because they, being more rational actors than the United States right now, don't want a full war. But at the same time, you're talking about an unremittent campaign of terrorism against Iran and the United States. There's no other word for it. What else could they do? And before, you know, and anybody, I mean, I'm sure people watching, you know, is self-selected, but any idiot that would watch this and say that that is a justification or a support or any of this other garbage, I'm asking you rationally. I'm asking you rationally. Take Saudi, a vicious, disgusting, obscene, genocidal, and internally repressive monarchy. that causes nothing but strife and misery and tacky buildings, as far as I'm concerned. If a Saudi general was visiting a foreign country and got assassinated on a commercial jet after that same country had unrelenting sanctions against them designed specifically to do things like deny people their cancer medications and maybe cause domestic airliners to crash, I would say the Saudis have a right, and indeed in the world that we're in now of nation states, a strategic necessity of some response. Now, I think this response might be extraordinarily stupid and very dangerous, what Iran is attempting to pull here. Maybe absolutely the wrong decision because they're doing it, of course, against a criminal lunatic administration. But how you could be on television as an analyst and you could say everything you want to say about how terrible Iran is and how everybody needs to ratchet down tensions, which is true. But to say after the endless goading and illegality, now we need to go into a third military crisis in the region? Afghanistan and Iraq are failures by every measure. They're humanitarian failures, first and foremost. They're also strategic military political failures. They're resource failures. And those things will pale in comparison to Iran. Pale. You better call people and say that they need to support the defunding of Sanders and Khanna that they've put on the table. And call and praise Barbara Lee. And this, again, this is why you can't fuck around with these nonsense statements that you get from people like Elizabeth Warren. I agree, actually, mostly with Drew. I'm not interested in. We need to evolve a world system out of this stuff, if that's humanly possible. I don't know. Maybe we're just doomed as a species. But I do know that I'm talking on a very real and pragmatic level. You can think whatever you want of the Quds Force or whatever else. When you have a unhinged criminal administration assassinating people, you don't start your statements with, well, he's a bad guy. Might not have been strategic. That's not how you oppose. You don't say, well, you know, Ho Chi Minh, blah, 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 the Viet Cong. No. You oppose genocide in Vietnam. You don't say, as people say all the time, Iraq, oh, what a strategic blunder. It was a crime. It was a multitude of crimes. And this is all at the same time, again, that all of these people freak out because Donald Trump tells some reporter to shut up. I'm not hearing like, wait a second. We have an unhinged administration that has literally built concentration camps and kidnapped children. Now they have broken every norm in the most flagrant way possible after waging an economic warfare against a country that observed an agreement that we broke up. And now they have responded. You're encouraging full-scale war on the same day that we have reports that Iranians, Americans of Iranian descent are getting stopped at borders in this country. I mean, are you fucking kidding me? It's disgusting. And I don't, what else can we do to cover it? I have no doubt if you look at CNN and MSNBC and all of these networks, and of course it goes without saying that Fox News, when the deep state isn't something to, spoon feed to brain dead morons justifying, the president having a trade war with China. So God knows what, I don't know, Ivanka wants to open up a new, knockoff Victoria's Secret franchise in Shanghai and the deep state's getting in the way of it. They're quite happy with the actual deep state that is the agent of U.S. murder and mayhem abroad, of which Donald Trump is an enhancer of. That has been the whole lesson of the last 3 years. That's why there's skyrocketing civilian casualties. That's why the drone program is unchanged. That's why we have operations happening across the world. And that's why This idiot, at the behest of Bolton and Pompeo and Graham and all these other ghouls, tore this agreement up that was working. There is literally not a single person, even under the metric of that agreement. We hate Iran, there's all these other problems, blah, 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 blah. That agreement was working.
Absolutely. My bad. Absolutely what you're saying, and I think you're hitting on something that's very important, because if you look at CNN and MSNBC and most of these outlets right now, it's like full trumpets already, right? Yep. We don't even have proper information about like the extent of the strikes. We know that 2 places were hit, right? Now there's some numbers that are floating around. They're being denied elsewhere. Like, it's still early days, but it's pure trumpets. People ready and ready for war. And it's so ridiculous when you pay attention to the fact that since Trump has come into office, a lot of these networks have focused so much on these wild stories, these wild scandals that they're trying to pin on Trump. Well, meanwhile, he's been parading around the world, destroying a deal that was keeping people safe and preventing war, ratcheting up conflict with Iran, also ratcheting up conflict across the world, as you were saying with, drone casualties. It's absolutely ridiculous when you've seen somebody act in such a callous, destructive manner as Donald Trump has for the past few years. And the focus has been about the most mundane, silly stuff when it comes to him. And when it's serious, when it's actually people's lives on the line, what do? They line up right behind him. And they justify this horrible, barbaric rationing up of conflict with the people that would be disastrous. And, and at the same time too, we don't know the extent of this strike right now. But what we do know is that Iran is in a situation where the second most powerful person in their state was just assassinated. And how are they going to respond? And, how do you expect any other kind of response?
There is no country in the world. You could take, this will be politically incorrect for a certain type of person, not a global, vicious campaign. But, again, if this happened to the United States, there would be a legitimate response. If this happened to China, there would be a legitimate response. If this happened to Saudi Arabia, if this happened to Israel, if this happened to Uganda, if we are in a nation state system and you take out a top general on a commercial flight and then threaten war crimes on Twitter, after strangling an economy for years, after breaking an agreement that they followed. I mean, it is insanity. It doesn't require any leftism or even any particular extraordinary empathy. This is basic rational thinking. And again, that is why I can't abide. People still whine about the Warren criticism, but it's like, look, this is serious shit. This is like, I get it. It's great. She wants to regulate the banks. Fantastic. Great. There is a whole world that we affect. Every single corner of this earth. This guy did something that is so unbelievably reckless and flagrant. And there's nothing else to say about it other than full, unequivocal resistance. There's no strategy. There's no mealy mouth. There's no bullshit. And again, I'm singling her out because, again, some people want to kind of joke about or, whatever, minimize the progressive lane. I expect Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg they are architects of the problem. Okay? So it's not even a question that they're going to come out and essentially agree to it in principle and, make some type of minimalizing, nerdy critique. But anybody that has pretensions of progressive leadership, I'm sorry. This stuff is not, it's too bad. But I'd like more plans.
Can we also just highlight this too, because I think it's very important, the irresponsibility of like ratcheting up this conflict in the first place because of what it's doing to Iraq, a country that has already suffered under the heel of U.S. imperialism, to now turn it into a de facto, theater of conflict between Iran and the United States is just so disgusting. The fact that there's bombs flying over Iraq right now is just another example of just the horrors that we've created in this region, and a real tragedy for the people in this country who have just seen endless warfare.
Sick. I think Matt might be here. Let's take a little break. Matt Christman will come here. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on, play some clips. I don't know. Obviously we're going to kind of stay current with this because fuck. But look, we'll take a brief break. We'll be right back with Matt Christman. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Great. Well, this event we're in is horrible. And it is, in the contrast to that, a great pleasure to welcome back to the show our buddy Matt Christman from Shoutout Trap House. Matt, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me.
Any reactions out of the gate to this?
The cartoon where they do the neck thing, the collar. I mean, obviously, we don't know yet exactly what's happening. There's a million conflicting reports and people just making stuff up.
Right. This is also true.
But, I mean, it's not the worst response we could have had, honestly. So, I mean, depending on how, now it's on us to react to them, which is always the horrifying part, having us, you know, Trump in there with all those psychos deciding what constitutes a proportionate response, considering that they don't really understand what any of that means. But, you know, rocket attacks on American bases in Iraq have happened before. So presumably they were prepared for them. It's, you know, within the war theater. So I don't know. That the horrible about this stuff is that you can't say anything because you don't know what's going to happen.
Well, on a brief tangent, I don't believe for a second that whole story that they put out saying like, oh, we gave him these options and the military actually wanted to pick the pussy options, but he picked the tough one. I mean, please, right? Like it's...
Yeah, they know who they're dealing with.
I think they know who they're dealing with, and I think they know what his boundless insecurity and relentlessly stupid mindset is. But I guess the hope was that they would respond in this way that might even be more effective and devastating. And, you know, like, not that I want this to happen, obviously, but yet in such a way that they could satisfy their need for a response, but it would be indirect enough that it wouldn't catch this idiot's attention and it wouldn't make Barry McCaffrey, you know, interrupt, you know, Ari Melber talking about like, you know, some, you know, I don't know, some new like Maltese guy that texted, you know, Don Jr. to say like, yeah, we need to have a full air war with Iran, which we just played.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes.
Well, the thing about Barry McCaffrey is that he's widely known for always being right about everything.
Can you talk about some of the things Barry McCaffrey has been right about?
Well, he was, for the kids out there, he was Bill Clinton's drug czar. I don't know if they even have drug czars anymore. I think they got rid of czars because of all of the Tea Party freaks who thought that meant that.
Wait, is that actually true?
The Soviet Union was coming.
Drug czar anymore?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe they do, but they changed the name. But I do know that there was that hilarious moment in early Obama when he appointed czars, and everyone just lost their shit because they're like, wait a minute, that's a Russian word. Which, of course, now, if that were to happen, if Trump were to start reporting czars, it would make the exact opposite people have the exact same reaction, which is cool to know that we're just stuck in an Ouroboros of idiocy that'll never end. But he was the drug czar under Clinton, and their policy was just stop, don't do it.
Right.
Stop doing it. We're going to throw you in jail if you do the drugs, which worked great, and that's why you don't have a drug problem anymore.
Right. Right. So he basically and I believe, I mean, I'm guessing, but I'm 98% certain that he was on cable promoting the invasion of Iraq.
Oh yeah,
right?
No, big time.
Yeah.
Yes. I think he was involved in the Panama invasion. I think that was his.
That was where he got his. That's where he got his start.
That's where he got his spurs. Was that amazing feat of military prowess?
Yeah, I have to say, what a pathetic generation. Like, at least like Petraeus and McChrystal and these other guys can say like, hey, like I cut my teeth committing like actual, you know, war crimes in actual situations. And then like the 80s generation were just like, well, you know, I clean shit up for those medical students in Grenada. Listen to me. Yeah. I invaded Club Med.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to sit on the board of Raytheon.
Yep. It's pretty, you can't even reflect back on your glorious time in service, which is why they yearn for oblivion.
Is that really, I mean, honestly, I don't, I feel doubly awkward saying this because one, I'm afraid I'm being ridiculous and pretentious, and two, it sounds disturbingly close to the Ileana Glazer stand-up bit. But is there some type of death instinct with these people?
Well, there's a death instinct with everyone. I mean, the death drive is a feature of psychology.
I like it.
And you know, like politics has to deal with the death drive. Like fascism is basically just weaponizing the death drive and focusing all politics around the death drive.
Talk about that more.
Well, I mean, it's others like Wilhelm Reich have talked about this, about how fascism is. Fascism yearns for oblivion, which is why every fascist regime has been destroyed eventually, because it cannot stop. It cannot find stable borders and peace with its neighbors, because that undermines its whole psychological raison d'etre. You have to continue pressing and pushing until you've annihilated your enemy, which of course is impossible. So really you're just going to end up annihilating yourself, which is where fascism always ends up. What we've had since the fall of the Nazis and stuff is this sort of managed, where we take the fascist instinct and we sort of manage it in such a way that it helps us, where we need it, but it doesn't drive us over the cliff. But now we're reaching a point where, due to resource scarcity and global warming, where it really is changed dramatically, or everyone will die. And I think this is the first generation of people who are getting to that realization and deciding, okay, well then we'll just all die.
Right.
Like to do the other than that, to confront, what we've done with our lives, what we've done with the planet, what we've done to other people is too great a horror. It's better to just press the gas and just slam into the brick wall rather than confront those things. And
or
the older you are,
die. I mean, that's the Bruno Latour. I just read this Down to Earth by Bruno Latour, and he's saying he's correlating the Trump fantasy of basically, I mean, hitting the gas. That's what he's talking about in terms of things like global warming and this fake nationalism. And also, though, the Silicon Valley guy is buying bunkers in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually also the oligarchs saying let's hit the gas and we're not really part of this anymore.
Right.
Or maybe you're not part of this anymore.
Yeah. I hate, everyone hates when you make the Roman references, but what happened
could you do though?
In the late Roman Empire? What really happened is that local powers lost all faith in the ability of the central authority to do anything, to effectively govern, to protect the frontiers, and so they stopped sending their people to serve in the military. They stopped sending taxes. They built walls around their estates, and they created these that became the model of feudalism after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and they created their little micro powers. And you can see the process has been going on as the private wealth has been magnified beyond anybody's conception. It has been going towards, a lot of it has been going towards creating these parallel pseudo-state networks that allow them to operate outside. The one that always tricks me, is just very emblematic, is the helicopters of Sao Paulo. We're not going to do anything about this unworkable urban hell we've created, but we can buy helicopters and then just literally hop over it and not have to interact with it at any point.
But the next phase now in Sao Paulo is we're going to keep the helicopters, but now, and I'm not making this is true, maybe it's also now legal for you to shoot people from your helicopter that you feel uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
That is so the helicopter is the neoliberal phase.
Yeah.
Now we're in the Trump Bolsonaro phase.
Yes.
Keep the helicopter and also stand your airspace.
Yeah. I mean, you could really argue that the entire sphere of acceptable political argument between, neoliberal left and the fascists, and it's just really to the degree to which we are willing to maintain pretenses.
Right.
The willing which we're willing to go through the effort of maintaining the facile lies that keep social harmony, because at a certain point, if you have reached escape velocity and you have that network and you don't really, then it doesn't matter if this whole thing, if there's any cohesion. What difference does it make? I've already divorced from it. Ben Elton, the guy who created Blackadder and The Young Ones, he wrote a book in the 80s. I forgot the name of it, but I remember reading it. And it was in 1985, and the premise was all the richest people in the world have gotten together, and they have been told by all the scientists that they've hired to tell them that the Earth is done. that we cashed it and it's just a matter of time. And so they secretly create a program to build private spaceships to go to lunar colonies. And now we're in 2020, and the only difference between that book and reality is that they're not hiding it. They're not doing it behind anybody's back. They're explicitly telling you, we're going to the Mars, we're going to the moon, we're going wherever we have to avoid what's coming that we created.
Right. And again, like in the Latour version, he'll say like it's in some sense it feels so gentle compared to what's happening now, but like a preview of it is George H.W. Bush at the Rio summit in the early 90s saying the American way of life is not on the table. It's not on the table. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're having this whole conference because there's a consensus that we are literally going to make where we live uninhabitable. Yeah. And the one rider I have to put on this is that the main contributor to the problem, non-negotiable. And
what's so, I mean, I think there is something to the argument, and that has to be reckoned with. That, you know, I mean, there will have to be, even with a real a massive investment in, you know, a Green New Deal and changing infrastructure, like lifestyles will have to change, and people in a democratic system aren't going to want to do that. Right. But honestly, I feel like if you put it in, if people understood the stakes, they would. The problem is that for the people in charge, their loss would be greater than anybody's.
Exactly.
And they therefore no one's going to put it on the table in a way that is going to be anything other than this gerrymandered, ridiculous argument about, you know, plastic straws and flying to Hawaii and all this stuff.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I might have a better train system is different than I have to divest my Exxon stock.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, those are really different stakes. I mean, are you then, I mean, I have no interest. I didn't read Bastani's book, and I enjoy the work of Navarre. I've seen of them a lot, but just as a frame, do you have a concern with that space communism thing in terms of just the notion that there isn't some part on the table that's like, we're not talking about some type of neo hunter-gatherer, like other extreme fantasy, but like there are limits. I mean, even with the greatest innovation, like a lifestyle where I'm on my soapbox for a second, but it's like Long Island cannot continue.
Nor should it, honestly. Forget global warming.
How dare you, man? I have family from there. You don't get the fuck out of here. How dare you? It's a noble place. Produced Eddie Murphy, Howard Stern, at least some members of Public Enemy.
Billy Joel.
A lot of really good routines about Italian people done by Eddie Murphy. The whole what Italian guys are like after they see Rocky would not exist.
Yes.
Without Long Island. But you know what I'm saying? It's like you can't. It's like, look, of course, it has to be synchronized. We're not talking about just folding back into the woodwork, right? But at the same time, like, I don't think we can totally, you know, discount. Like, some of the ideas that the hippies had were right. Like, actually, yeah, it is a good idea to, if you can, grow some of your own food and think about sustainability in an actual practical communitarian way.
Well, the thing is that I think that one thing that would help with that is if more was done to focus the degree to which the stuff that you think of as the collective decision of the people was not at all. These options are, you know, like growing your own food. Most people can't do that.
They just can't do it.
And it's not because they don't want to.
Right.
I mean, maybe they wouldn't want to, but it's not something that could even get into their mind because the conditions don't exist for it, and that was on purpose.
Right.
And like that is true. It's true certainly with transportation. I mean, we talk about the glory of the automobile and all that, but like at this point, these are not decisions anyone can make. You know, in a large part of this country, you know, the people stuck in traffic jams, you can say about them, they don't want a train, they want their own car.
I would love a train. Are you fucking kidding me?
If you really put it to them, taking 2 hours of your day in this thing and not being able to do anything else but drive yourself insane while moving, slower than if you were walking. I don't think people would accept that out of like a menu of options.
Absolutely.
But because it's what we have, we get path dependency, and then we decide, actually, no, I do want this. Because who wants to admit that their lives have, their choices have been prescribed in America? Because that's the fantasy of all the fantasies, is the idea that any of this is stuff that we chose.
It's like the Zizek elevator thing, right? The elevator thing you used to use all the time.
Yeah.
Where it's pre-programmed, but you have like you can press the closed door button. It makes no difference.
But you feel like you're
contributing
that is a
to
huge
it.
pet peeve of mine. Like, what do you think you're doing? You're not accomplishing anything. It's already lit up. What are you doing?
When I see somebody doing that, I actually put my foot in the door. It's like, I did change the outcome here.
Yeah, I'm alive. I am alive.
I want to play this clip. I like this because this is actually something that I've been complaining a lot about the past couple of days. I'm not saying I'll do endless bits about it. I'll do a bit of Obama mourning Soleimani, but like, I'm not even. You don't even have to go to like, fuck you, Dad. He was actually great, right? But the idea that we talk about him in such a childish way has real implications. I mean, we're going to get to the Elizabeth Warren thing in a second. That she can get browbeat by Meghan McCain is a problem. And if this McChrystal quote, I mean, you're just pulling it up, but this is actually great if this is what he said. Because this is a guy who, and he's an operative fighting proxy wars, which are not nice things.
No.
Proxy wars are really fucked up. A lot of people get hurt. A lot of resources are mismanaged that way. This is not a great way of conducting international affairs.
Soleimani's support is still very strong, and of course now stronger than ever. But it's been going down. It was going down a little bit because people were sick of spending all this money fighting in Syria and in Iraq instead of a country whose economy has been struggling so much.
Right. Yes, you could blame the Western sanctions, but also why is it of the little resources we do have are being used for all of these operations across the region instead of like dealing with the fact that Iran has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. But this idea of him as like an evildoer, is it's not just embarrassing from the perspective of like a cool kid in Brooklyn. It is dangerously stupid to feed into that frame. So but please, I mean, I'll stop ranting. But this is McChrystal.
America, we kind of like dastardly villains to hate, and he has occupied that space very nicely. He is the quintessence of global evil. Not a sparrow falls that Qasem Soleimani didn't personally shoot it down.
I don't think we should view him as an evil person. I think we should view him just like I believe in my country. I think Qasem Soleimani believes in his country, just as I would propagate the aims of mine, he would do his.
I don't know why that is so hard to replicate that level.
There's a reason he's saying that, because he recognizes that he is that guy. He's our guy. He is our Soleimani. And if Soleimani is a monster, he has, God bless him for having enough self-awareness to realize that makes him a monster. And the thing is, that's the response. It's like, Soleimani, was he a bad guy on balance? Probably. I mean, he did help suppress those protests. He cut his teeth suppressing Kurdish and leftist protests in 1979. But he is not any worse than Stanley McChrystal or Jim Mattis or any of these other guys.
What do you think they're doing? They're going in these places and handing out super soakers. They're fighting counterinsurgency and guerrilla wars. That's what that shit is.
Mad Dog Mattis, the guy who everyone loves, destroyed the city of Fallujah. He completely wiped it out, dropped a bunch of white phosphorus and depleted uranium on it, so much so that kids are still being born with birth defects there. By the way, we're the only country that uses depleted uranium, so whatever you want to say about what Soleimani did in Syria or anywhere else, he's not creating kids with birth defects. That's on our beloved, bipartisanly loved, even after serving in the Trump administration, warrior monk Jim Mattis.
Right, because occasionally he put out like a, I've heard on background that Mattis wasn't super excited that Trump called that kid with cerebral palsy a loser. So he's really holding things.
He expressed mild disapproval of Trump's
mild
Twitter feed.
disapproval.
But that's the way to frame it. It's like, and if that makes you horrified at the thought that we have guys like Soleimani, well, then stop to think maybe they shouldn't be doing that either. And maybe, and we have way less of an excuse for it than they do, by the way.
Infinitely less.
Because all of these ops they were doing, they were all responding to power vacuums and destabilizations caused by our military adventures in a country 5,000 miles away. These are literally the countries right next door to them. So if anybody has a right to be doing these sort of ops, which are always going to be morally murky at least, and war crimes most of the time, it's much more them than us. So that means that our guys are worse than Soleimani in any objective measurement. And at very least, they're doing the same thing. And that is why the terrorism thing is, if you say he's a terrorist, you've lost the entire game. Because if he's a terrorist, and then you're saying, yes, but we shouldn't have killed him, well, then you just look like a pussy. You look like the guy in every cop movie who tells the hero, you got to get a warrant for that. He's out there killing
That's not
children.
how we do things in Beverly Hills. I have Eddie Murphy on the brain.
He's sniping children from... So what? You need to make sure that you've got all the warrant. You got to read him his rights or he's back on the street. You want to be that guy? Nobody likes that guy. Meanwhile, you got Trump being like, yeah, he's a terrorist. I took him out. I protected American lives. Of course that's going to look better.
Yes, if you buy the... Absolutely. If you buy the premise, it's the right thing to do. And incidentally, yes, as a thought experiment, which I generally loathe as a term, would you be cool with Iran occupying Barbados and funding a hostile government? I mean, it's just, or not even Barbados.
Mexico.
That's the analogy.
If the Iranians took over Mexico.
Yeah, the Iranians took over Mexico.
Installed a puppet government. Bungled the occupation they were doing to the degree that they were not able to even enforce a new order. They just created conditions for a civil war between the existing
killed over 1 million people
there.
And then metastasized like a drug cartel supergroup, the likes of which we have never seen before. Yeah. And then
some sort of Zeta's ISIS hybrid.
Right, exactly. And then when they actually needed to fight that hybrid, the national army that they organized totally folded. Yeah. And you needed to come in with your militia, which again, just objectively, what Soleimani has done recently, his recent record is beating ISIS and backing the Houthis, which, I am, the Houthis are right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just, and yes, God bless him for the self-awareness. Now, let's check this out. And again, I always hear the voice of the people who are touchy about criticizing Warren. And I'm, probably you've either accepted that if you're still watching this show or, I don't know. You've somehow,
you're seeing this clipped on YouTube.
You're seeing this clipped on YouTube and you're upset and you're going to give me look at Biden. And, I know. I think I've managed to flip the huge amount of Biden supporters that tune into the show. But this isn't just like nitpicking. I mean, this is the idea that you can slot a candidate that claims to be fighting the progressive lane, and the domestic stuff I don't buy either relative to Bernie. But I mean, the idea that you can just bracket the whole rest of the world as, she's not so good at that, but XYZ. Speaking of words that are really overused that I don't use at all anymore because they're just used in too many off contexts, I'm going to have to tell you that's an extremely privileged perspective. But let's check this out.
You issued a statement calling Soleimani a murderer. Later, you issued a second statement saying that he was, quote, an assassination of a senior foreign military official. Now, this is a man who obviously is responsible for hundreds of American troops' deaths, carnage that we can't even imagine. The Treasury Department and the State Department have both designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. I don't understand the flip-flop. I don't understand why it was so hard to call him a terrorist, and I would just like you to explain.
So, I appreciate it, and I appreciate your kind comments. You know, all three of my brothers served in the military. We've talked about this before.
I believe you respect the military.
And I know you do too.
Now, again, I know that I'm being super indulgent here, but you know, the preferred response in a nice Brooklyn accent is, "And your father fucking sucked too." All right, go ahead.
This isn't a change. They're true. The question is, what is the response that the President of the United States should make, and what advances the interests of the United States of America? Think about Saddam Hussein. You want to talk about a bad guy, right? However, going to war in Iraq was not in the interests of the United States. We lost thousands of American lives. It cost us here at home. It has cost us around the world. It has been a part of this cost in the Middle East that has ended up with millions of people who've lost their lives, who've been injured, who've been displaced. The question for the President of the United States is to understand what's going on, have an overall strategy, and pick an appropriate response. And going back to Libby's question, at an appropriate time. He's part of a group that has been designated. He is part of a group that's been designated.
He's not a terrorist.
Of course he is. He's part of a group that our federal government has designated as a terrorist.
Super reliable.
Which government was that that designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization? Was that the awful psycho Trump administration that did that? I'm pretty sure.
Well, it's also like this same government that a terrorist group called, or that a group I would call a terrorist group, the MEK, could like pay, you know, Rudy Giuliani and Howard Dean to like go hang out with them, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna take it off the terrorist list. Why?
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with any change in behavior? No.
Yeah. Of course he's a terrorist, but we shouldn't kill him. Of course he's a terrorist. Of course he's a threat to Americans.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't kill him.
Yeah.
Bernie went. I actually saw Bernie on The View when he went in September, when I had to watch it as part of a bet for a month.
I was gonna say, you're not a View connoisseur.
No, and I'm glad that he's got it out of the way, because I don't know how he would respond. Because that if anyone has watched The View, it is designed to make your brain feel like it's being shut down from lack of oxygen. Like there's no through line to any conversations. It's just a bunch of people yelling at each other. It's honestly avant-garde television. It's like it is defeating meaning on purpose. It's almost Dadaist. And then they wheel out these politicians, and then they just have, like, I remember when Bernie was on, Whoopi yelled at him, because she's Yang Gang, by the way.
Are you serious?
Yes, she's all about Andrew Yang.
Oh my
and
God.
She was telling.
That's the most disillusioning experience.
And well, the thing that really got her is the way that Yang phrased the freedom dividend to her. It's like, well, take the money from Amazon and give it to people. And
you mean take the additional tax that you will pay when you have a transition with Amazon and funnel it back to yourself?
Yeah. But yes. So whatever that was, it really like clearly struck with her, and so she kept, and so she was like yelling at Bernie, saying like, "What are you going to raise taxes on these corporations? I haven't heard you talking about that. I haven't heard. What's going on? Are you going to raise taxes on these corporations?" And he went, "Yes, of course." And she's like, "Well, I haven't heard it," because it was Wang put it in a specific thing of money from Amazon to you, and like that got in her head.
Right.
And
that's tracked.
But then it's not. And then of course, Megan had to be like, "What are you going to do? How are you going to act bipartisanly? Who are you going to work with among the Republicans? Who can you work with?"
Joe Lieberman collaborated to kill a lot of people. Yeah. What are you going to do like that?
And Bernie said, like, "Well, your dad was a guy I could work with." And then she goes, "He's dead," which was very funny. Someone who's not dead.
Someone who's not dead.
Yeah. And then I think
the woman mentions the guy like once every 5 minutes, and she doesn't have the decency to give him a little pat on the head for the blatant ass kissing attempts.
No, my father is dead, sir.
Oh my gosh!
So I'm just glad no one should go on this show. I'm glad it was earlier in the campaign, because it is just there to be, and the most important thing that I realized watching it is that it is literally 50-50 commercials and programming. There's none of the segments run more than 5 minutes. So it is not designed to be watched. No one actually sits and watches it. They have it on while they're vacuuming or something.
That makes sense.
So nobody cares what's being said on this awful program.
But we'll go to the post game in a minute. But I want to just ask you, I mean, real quick, do you feel? I feel like Bernie is a little bit more in like, it's a little bit more fuck it. I feel like.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that big dickhead tweet after. Saying I was against the Iraq War. I was against, and everyone dropped their monocles. It's like, this is
Remember Soledad O'Brien? Sigh.
Oh God.
Like, okay. He's like,
because
Jonas Salt's talking about curing diseases again.
But it was beautiful because, like, it is stark and absurd the degree to which Bernie stands alone as an American politician of his stature in his record of opposing everything bad that has happened. And he's running against people in the same party that he's not a member of, whose record is the exact opposite and have only worked to make everything worse on every front, and especially on foreign policy and the war in Iraq and everything. And there was just... Before this happened, it just wasn't something anyone decided to talk about. Part of it is because foreign policy, I guess, is off. People don't talk about it now as much as it was. It used to be central. I mean, that's why Obama won, honestly, over Clinton, was because he was against the Iraq War. Although if he'd been in the U.S. Senate, he 1,000,000% would have voted for it. He should thank Bobby Rush for having not been in a position to vote on the Iraq War one way or the other.
Bobby Rush kicked his ass.
Yeah. But this is important. And everybody else is either has a monstrous record, is a literal CIA agent, or is a weather vane, or is somebody who clearly has not thought about foreign policy to any degree, and thinks that it's something that can just sort of be managed, even though we are reaching a point where these conflicts are only going to become more sharp and intense as resources deplete. And if you don't have some sort of model for an alternative foreign policy that is around, mutual de-escalation, then you're just going to get pulled around by the brass when you're in there. They're going to get that same list of options in front of you, and you're going to find yourself without any constituency to resist them for it.
That's 100% right. I actually would, I'm forgetting the name of the book right now, but there are some very interesting books that are, like not left certainly, but actually well-reported books, like a book like Directorate S by Steve Cole, or other books specifically on the drone program, which basically show you you're going with Obama, who is not even, who is absolutely happy and excited to be a part of the establishment in every possible sense. However, he does come in the first couple of weeks with this idea that, like, hey, I'm a lawyer and I kind of campaigned against Guantanamo and I've got some reservations about drones. And if you just read the way that these people were able to work him, because he didn't have a firm ideological ground to push back from, and there's no actual political context behind these nice gestures like shutting down Guantanamo. I mean, you got to really, there was a story that everybody forgets about, but this kid from Nigeria tried to blow up a plane going to Detroit,
underwear bomber.
The underwear bomber. And, it was a kind of a depressing, like, or the original Fell Son.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's there. His underwear started smoking on the plane. They did an emergency landing. That event was like the closing case for the defense, intelligence schools, Rahm Emanuel, these types to say, like, okay, dude. And literally they had a kill list. I mean, that was on the schedule at the Obama White House. And I actually think it's useful to not say that, like Obama is obviously a different person than Trump or even Bush. And he clearly was personally more not into the idea of killing innocent people, but he had zero ideological ground. He had zero movement or commitment, and they could put him in a corner incredibly quickly.
And he didn't have anybody with him to create a counter proposal.
Exactly.
Whereas Bernie is clearly bringing together everybody who has spent the last 12 years or last 20 years shouting into the wilderness under this umbrella, and they're going to be able to have this counter hegemonic argument about what to do with American military power.
Exactly. And what about Tulsi Gabbard? I'm such an instigator tonight. I mean, so it's just that comment. All right. We're going to go to the post game. We're going to play some more sound. We're going to do a debunk with Ben Burgess. The great Matt Christman is going to continue with us. We're going to check back in, obviously, with what's going on with this. Oh, actually, really quick. Speaking of what you're saying about weather vanes and not even knowing what you're talking about, I have just been handed the first relevant CNN fact check in my life, which is Amy Klobuchar falsely claims Iran is announcing it will develop a nuclear weapon. Now, the Klobuchar campaign has walked this back, but I mean, it's just so perfect that it's like, I'm going to attack Trump for being irresponsible in a mindless way that actually is maybe even, it can't be more irresponsible than Trump because it's not an action, but it's as irresponsible as you could get outside of an actual action.
Because that is one of the fundamental misunderstandings, and it's of course propagated on purpose at every level, that there is some sort of active Iranian nuclear program. Right. That somehow was still happening, that it was even happening before the deal.
Never,
which
any
it wasn't.
Evidence, none.
And even more perniciously, that it kept going on after the deal. And there's no proof of any of that. And they were holding on to the deal until they killed Soleimani. So when she's saying that, she is saying that they've been developing nuclear weapons while the deal was in place, which means that she is saying that the Obama Iran nuclear deal was a bad one and was us being played by the devious Persians who are secretly continuing their nuclear program, which means that there can be no negotiation or any kind of diplomacy because they are so treacherous. Because, well, they were developing a nuclear weapon. And that what we need is to have someone to tell people that never happened. There was never a nuclear program in the first place.
We need to have someone to tell people. And I say this as somebody who's like, look, anti-war movement, look, well, of course it needs to focus on civilian casualties and the cost of U.S. murder machine and everything else. But I don't think you should be out on the streets saying America, KKK, and all of that. You need to absolutely embrace symbols of patriotism and make things be normal and approachable for as big a set of people as possible. And at the same time, a presidential candidate can't say this, but I will say the appropriate action is not only Iran was following the deal, the most appropriate action is an actual apology tour and a restating of the deal, a re-signing of the deal with restitution for economic loss because of the sanctions. I mean, whatever way you need to do that isn't in those words or that overt. But.
Or you do what me and Felix have been thinking about, which is steal some nukes and give them to Iran. Because if we want
other lesson did you learn? What other lesson?
If they announce tomorrow, hey, we've got nukes, then this whole thing cools off very quickly. So honestly, let's get a GoFundMe going to buy a couple of suitcase nukes from Ukraine or something, and get them to Iran.
Let's get Lev Parnas on the phone.
Yeah,
then we can get the resistance people interested. I heard that Lev Parnas was at a GoFundMe to get a suitcase nuke to Iran because Trump wants them to have in Iran to have suitcase nukes because that's what Putin wants. That was the plan. The plan was
all about arming Iran secretly.
The plan was to assassinate Soleimani so the left would have a GoFundMe campaign to protect Iran so Putin could sign a new surface-to-air missile deal.
Well, I'm sure you saw that, Nira, after the Soleimani assassination. It's like, yes, look at all this instability in Iraq. This is all to Putin's benefit.
Wait, can I see if the board works for that? This is going to be a long wind-up here because I don't usually use this board, but I need to do this before we go to the post-game. All right. So she saw that and she said, who benefits from all of this instability?
All I know is that I sent her a brainless Wojak as a response. So I can probably find it that way.
That's easy.
I've just decided that that's all I'm doing now for Nira is sending her brainless Wojaks until she blocks me.
Yeah, probably.
Here it is. Here it is. I found it.
Please.
It is this. So it's when the Iraqi. This is when the Iraqi parliament voted to make American troops leave.
Oh yeah,
and she said, "You know who loves this news and will now have a much wider footprint in the Middle East? Putin." Yeah,
Don't piss down
just
my
the
back.
dumbest on earth.
I'm taking on enough right now. I can't even process that one.
It's 12th dimensional chess. You don't even understand it.
It's like there's a very narrow set of people. It's like I said a couple weeks ago. If Vladimir Putin had somebody like, if he was just like, well, then that's going to happen and Joy Reid will get promoted. So somebody should definitely write some anti-gay blog posts from 2007. If he actually strategizes like that, we should absolutely concede the global system.
He should be in charge.
No
he
doubt.
should be the global ruler.
Yes. I mean, absolutely.
Obviously, anyone with that kind of foresight and genius, strategic genius, we have no chance. We have no hope of defeating him.
The only people who think that about Vladimir Putin are like maybe like one or two RT programmers, Mira Tandon,
yes,
Hillary Clinton, and at times when he's really high, Oliver Stone.
Yep.
No one else is buying into this. But actually, a lot of love to Oliver Stone. In these times, you got to take literally anything you can get. We're going to go to the post game, a bunch of stuff. Guys, thanks everybody for all of the great continued growth, and join us on Patreon. Next week, I'm traveling and pretty excited about it. I'm not going to say what it is yet, but I'll let people know. The week after, I'm going to be doing a panel with, it hasn't been announced yet, but I need to announce it now because we weren't doing a show till later in the week next week, but I'm doing a panel at Harvard, Cornell West, and so more information will come out about that soon.
Yale and Harvard.
The
past couple of months.
TMBS Ivy League tour.
This is the first time I've ever noticed Meghan McCain's Twitter bio. It's live free or die.
Yes.
# fuck cancer. American flag emoji, cactus emoji.
That's, oh my God. Matt, Christman,
really good stuff.
Tell all the people all the ways that they could find your great work, please.
On Twitter at Cushbomb and Chapo Trap House every week. A hot, fresh podcast available for everyone. And then Patreon exclusives also.
The man can go from General McChrystal to Wilhelm Reich to a auteur's critique of Meghan McCain's Twitter bio. We love him. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the postgame.